Not yet.
15, we'll just say for the sake of round numbers, from 1560 down to the present day, those words have stood virtually unaltered in the English Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer from 1559. That is the same book that is still used in the Church of England. It's progressed here in the United States. Episcopal Church updated the Book of Common Prayer probably 1928, I think, was the first update. And occasionally you will see, like if you see an Anglican church or an Episcopal church, sometimes it'll say Book of Common Prayer 1928 on it. And those are churches that did not accept the 1979 revisions to the Book of Common Prayer, but wanted to hold to the 1928 or to go back to it, as the case may be. And various reasons abound for that, but the point that I'm wanting to make tonight is simply that we have been shaped and molded by the language of the English Reformation in ways that we don't even know, because we consider that to be the traditional marriage ceremony. The words are very familiar, but they're straight out of the Book of Common Prayer. And if someone wants a traditional ceremony, that's what we go to. That's what I go to. The words are familiar. They are often, sometimes altered, often been altered over the years, but in form and content have remained essentially the same. And so tonight we're going to be looking at the second half of our session from last week. Yes, we've got plenty of these actually to go around. We'll leave two extra copies. Anyone else need a copy? We're down at the very bottom where it says Edward VI, the Protestant boy king. And I'm just going to recap a little of this because we looked at some of it last week. That in 1547, Henry dies. Henry VIII dies. To the everlasting relief of Catherine Parr, who is left as his surviving, and emphasis on the surviving spouse. She is number 6. They did not all fare so well. The ones who fared well simply marriages were annulled, but 2 lost their heads. Both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard both were beheaded for various reasons. Others had their marriages annulled, and Catherine Parr is left as the stepmother to Edward VI and Elizabeth I, who became Elizabeth I, just Queen Elizabeth. We would know her later on. She is an evangelical, as was Anne Boleyn, as probably was Anne of Cleves, but Anne of Cleves was not really, marriage was never consummated. It was not a real true marriage, you might say. But when Henry dies, Edward is only 9. He's left as the so-called boy king. He's the King Josiah, if you will, of England. Remember, Josiah was only 8 years old when he became king. And so, but remarkably convictional for a 9-year-old. He understands the faith, and he has been Protestant educated, and he's been Protestantly brought up. And so what happens during this time of Edward VI is the first edition of the Book of Common Prayer comes out, because Thomas Cranmer is one of those guys that has a deep influence on Edward VI. He's one of his mentors, as it were. And so, during this time, Parliament is busy repealing laws that establish Catholic doctrine. They take all that away. a lot of the images are removed from the churches. The priests are allowed to marry. And Thomas Cranmer is busy about getting his Book of Common Prayer together. And he is, in 1549, it's really just a stopgap book. It's hastily put together in its first edition, and but it's a start to begin moving English Catholicism, or Anglicanism, as it were, away from the Catholic Church, away from the Pope, certainly, which was really accomplished before that, but away from Catholic doctrines on communion, and those steps were continued in 1552 when Martin Bucer comes along, B-U-C-E-R, and Martin Bucer is a Lutheran. And he comes alongside Cranmer, he's a German guy, comes alongside Cranmer and helps him make the Book of Common Prayer more Protestant, and begins using language that is going to be more amenable to a Protestant thing, a Protestant church. The altar is no longer the altar, but it's the table. The priests are now referred to as ministers. Christians were told in communion to feed on Christ in thy heart with faith by thanksgiving. Actually, that language didn't come along until about 1559, when another fellow by the name of Peter Martyr Vermilion, he's a martyr of the faith, comes along and helps Thomas Cranmer on the third edition. And so the language in the Book of Common Prayer is it goes back and forth between language you might think you would hear in a more Lutheran setting and language you would hear in a more Presbyterian setting, to say, for lack of a better term. So the language, however, is so beautiful. Cranmer's gift is ever present through that book. And while we don't have a Book of Common Prayer, if there were ever a book that would make you wish we did, it would be the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. So all this is going on during Edward's time. Cranmer also is busy working on his 42 articles. Now the 42 articles are later pared down to just 39 articles. And that is the same articles that are considered to be the articles of faith of the Anglican Communion Episcopal Church here in the United States and all around the world. Those have remained essentially the same. And Edward only lives for 6 years. He dies at, before he's 16 or around 16 years of age. Dies without an heir. He is not married, but there have been a lot of reforms during that time. Who comes on the scene? When he dies, there is someone waiting in the wings, and it's Mary Tudor, or rather, it's Mary Tudor, right? Also known as Bloody Mary. It's interesting that she, of course, is raised Catholic. Her mother was Catherine of Aragon. She is the granddaughter, therefore, of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who were Catherine's parents. She is the first cousin to Charles, the Emperor. Is it Emperor Charles? I forget if his name is Charles. Anyway, the Holy Roman Emperor is her first cousin. And everyone is steeped in Catholicism, including her. And so when Edward dies, you can imagine all this Protestantizing that's gone on, all these reforms that have been made are just, in a very short amount of time, go out the window. She's only on the throne for 5 years. And she's not exceptionally cruel or vindictive, but it's just what you did in the 16th century was you burned heretics at the stake. And boy, does she ever get after it. In 5 years, 300 are burned at the stake. She is busy about restoring Catholicism to England and making it once again under the control of the Pope. Edward's dying words were, "O Lord God, defend this realm from papistry and maintain thy true religion." Well, I'm sure that it seemed to those who were alive at that time that that was not happening. They were not being defended from papistry. They had it imposed on them. And around 1554, she replaces Thomas Cranmer, with a guy by the name of Reginald Pole. He becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury and the representative of the Pope there in England. And so this causes a lot of people just to flee. A lot of people get out of England entirely if they're concerned about their necks. And so all the freedoms that were enjoyed by the Protestants are now taken away. In just a matter of weeks, their world is turned upside down. And you think about this in terms of what Paul wrote to the Philippians in chapter 4 when he said, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I find myself. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." That verse is usually taken completely out of its context. And I always want to say, how about persecution? How about nakedness? How about sword? How about when everything is stripped away from you? That's what was really going on. Because again, you didn't suffer a witch to live, you didn't suffer a heretic to live, and they took this very seriously. There was no such thing as freedom of religion. That's a very modern kind of concept that comes later on, actually toward the end of Elizabeth's reign. You start seeing a lot more of that. But at this time, Mary's just doing what she thinks is right to do. It's got to cleanse this wicked leaven out of the kingdom and restore it back to the purity, in her mind, of the Pope. Well, there were various martyrs. Again, she's known as Bloody Mary, not because of she was cruel, but because of all this stuff happening in just a short amount of time, and a lot of people going to the stake. A couple of those were Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer. And maybe you've heard of Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer. Bishop Hugh Latimer is who that was. He was Ridley was the Bishop of London, and Hugh Latimer was one of his fellow bishops, a little bit older man. Ridley was the young man, and Latimer was the older man. While they're in prison, awaiting their fate, Latimer sends a letter to Ridley. And here's the content of it, part of the content. "There is no remedy but patience. Better it is to suffer what cruelty they will put upon us than to incur God's high indignation. Wherefore, be of good cheer in the Lord, with due consideration what he requireth of you, and what he doth promise you. Our common enemy shall do no more than God will permit him. God is faithful, which will not suffer us to be tempted above our strength." That's, of course, a reference to 1 Corinthians 10:13. And so you can see already they're strongly relying on the promises of Scripture. And so even as they're at the stake, being burned at the stake. You know, this whole idea of being burned at the stake was handled differently at different times under different regimes. Sometimes, for example, you might have a strangulation of the person first, and then their body would be burned at the stake. But in this instance, Latimer and Ridley were there together at the stake, and Latimer turned to his friend and uttered these famous words, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day, by God's grace, light such a candle in England as I trust shall never be put out. The dark irony and the humor that is present there, even in that phrase, we shall light a candle. Here we are. We are the fuel for that candle to be lit. Well, let's just say that Hugh Latimer could say that a little bit easier than Ridley could, because he expired pretty quickly. But the wood was badly laid at the feet of Master Ridley. And so his arms ended up burning off before he ever expired. So this is the kind of suffering that people went through for the sake of the gospel. This murderous rampage was not yet through because Thomas Cranmer, author of the Book of Common Prayer, is still alive. Something's got to be done about him. So he is now in the crosshairs of Mary as well. And it's possible that she had a little bit of a personal vendetta against Cranmer. He had not looked favorably on her mother's marriage to Henry. Remember, there was a lot of controversy over that. The fact that Henry is married off, really, to Catherine as a way to keep the money in the family. She's married, first of all, to the heir to the throne was Arthur. Henry was being groomed for the priesthood, of all things. He was going to be a cleric. He was well versed in poetry and literature and theology, and even theology. And at age 17, his brother dies. After only 6 months of marriage to Catherine, no heir. So he's put into this really difficult situation. He's 17. I think by the time he marries, he is 18. Catherine is 24. So it's not a great, it's not like she's some old hag. That's probably not the best way to put it, like you said here coming out of my mouth. But neither is this a marriage of love by any means, and it's not uncommon. But not a very happy beginning to it. But they did have 5 children, only one of whom lived past infancy, and that was Mary. And so now that she's in charge, she gets to call the shots, and Cranmer was one of those over there clucking his tongue at this unbiblical marriage. And so what happens? She starts turning the thumbscrews down on Cranmer, gets him to recant his faith, gets him to go back on his Protestantism. That report is spread to Mary's belief throughout England, and a lot of distress and sorrow created because of that on the part of the Protestants. But it didn't get Cranmer out from under the death sentence. He was still going to die. He's still going to go to the stake. So I'm not sure if he was promised something that was not fulfilled, or if it was just in order to get the torturing away from him for the time being. But he wasn't through. Before his execution took place, just a stone's throw from where Latimer and Ridley's had just a few years before, he was called on to speak. And these words from his own lips confessed his own sins, his own weaknesses, and it was during that time that he repented of his recantation. He said, "My words were written contrary to the truth which I thought in my heart, and written for fear of death, to save my life, if it might be. And forasmuch as I have written many things contrary to what I believe in my heart, my hand shall first be punished. For if I may come to the fire, it shall first be burned. As for the Pope, I refuse him for Christ's enemy and Antichrist, with all his false doctrine." This is common language, by the way, in that day. To refer to the Pope as Antichrist was Of course he's the
Who
Antichrist.
was the 17-year-old?
Henry VIII
Henry VIII?
was 17 when his brother passed away, and he was then the heir to the throne at that young age, and was married off in a marriage of, well, Catherine of Aragon was, brought the whole Spanish wealth to England. And in fact, it was later, I think it may have been her brother that was Philip II, who had the Spanish Armada. If you remember, during Elizabeth's time, it was the Spanish Armada that came to really to bring England to its feet. And Sir Francis Drake was the captain of the English fleet that, in the face of that huge armada, there was much prayer that went up, and it was a huge storm that actually took them, it cast the Spanish Armada just completely adrift. And they were not able to accomplish that, and finally the remnants of that turned back to Spain. So anyway, I digress. The Cranmer puts his hand in the flame as you get his hand was burned while he was still completely conscious, and he was one of the few people, I would say, in Christian history who took Jesus' words from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 30, if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it's better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to go to hell. One of the few people who took that and made it a literal thing in his life. J.C. Ryle, who was a bishop in the Church of England in the late 19th century, I believe he died in 1905, one of the last evangelicals, probably preserved evangelical name in the Church of England, considered Cranmer's life and concluded this: nothing, in short, in all his life became him so well as the manner of his leaving it. Greatly he had sinned, but greatly he had repented.
So did he recant being Protestant, or did he recant Christ?
He recanted being Protestant. He recanted under extreme duress. He had recanted all of the things that he had done to destroy Catholicism in England. And so, under duress, recanted his Protestantism, but on, as he was being taken to the stake, recanted his recantation, if that makes sense.
So are you saying that Thomas Cranmer was Henry VIII's brother?
No, Cranmer was the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he was the bishop, if you will, who came in during the time that Edward VI becomes the boy king. Cranmer is there to help in this. He really wants to make the church Protestant. He really wants to make the Anglican Church Protestant. Remember, Henry didn't want a Protestant church. Henry wanted a Henry church. That's really the best you can say about it. He wanted what he wanted, which was English Catholicism. But he didn't want to change, really want to change anything. He just did not want the Pope to be in charge. Cranmer comes along, and he is now given some authority to do what needed to be done. But what ultimately happens, and we see it next under Elizabeth, which we'll just kind of go through this section rather quickly because of our time. But when Elizabeth comes to the throne, first of all, Mary dies childless. She dies in rather difficult circumstances. She does not have an heir. She wasn't hardly ever with her husband. It's just been a really difficult thing for her. But she passes away, and Elizabeth is brought to the throne. She had been told time and again by Philip II of Spain to do something to get rid of her, get rid of Elizabeth. But she never did. Or rather, Emperor, I shouldn't say, that was Emperor Charles V, who was her first cousin, that urged her to do that, to have Elizabeth killed and removed, but she didn't go that far. And so Elizabeth is now on the throne, and her reign lasts almost 50 years. I mean, there's a reason why we consider Elizabethan England to be what it is. I mean, that was the day of Shakespeare. That was the day of, the days when not the King James Bible, but the Geneva Bible and the predecessors of the King James Bible were being put into play. So the Protestantism that was in England at that time was genuine, but Elizabeth was not a radical either. She probably had as many political motives as theological motives to have this church be what it finally became. But she certainly was convictionally evangelical. She had to have been. She was raised by her stepmother, Catherine Parr, who was also evangelical. And she was raised in this warm atmosphere. When I say evangelical, I don't want you to think of modern day. You still have to think 16th century. But love for the Scripture, great respect for the Scripture. She read the Greek New Testament every day. I mean, this was something that you can't say for too many people in our day. So she begins to restore everything that Mary had undone. She begins to restore. The act of supremacy is put into place, reenacted. The Pope is repudiated. And really, the act of uniformity is the big deal. Because in the act of uniformity, in the act of supremacy, the queen is considered to be the governor of the church. Henry had taken the term head of the church, but it was considered really a little too edgy for the queen to take that name as head, so the words were changed to governor of the church, but she's still the physical head, as it were, for the Church of England. She comes in and is given this, she takes this authority and also gets the act of uniformity in place. And this is where everybody has to go to church, subject to fines. And if you don't go to church, meaning the Anglican Church, then you're going to be subject to fines, possibly imprisonment. There's all kinds of things. It was enforced church attendance. What do you think this did for piety in England? Not much. Not much. But it explains a whole lot of what we see in modern day Anglicanism and in modern day Episcopalism, because it's this middle way. It's not Catholic, it's not Protestant. It's Catholic in its ritual, it's Protestant in its doctrine. You still have vestments, you still have candles and robes and kneeling during communion and things like that, but you don't have the Pope, and you got a married clergy, you don't have...
Can you say that phrase again? I'm sorry. Catholic and ritual, Protestant and...
Yeah, doctrine.
Doctrine. Thank you.
So the 39 articles are very Protestant, but a lot of the ritual... In fact, I mentioned 1928 Book of Common Prayer. A lot of the reasons why congregations wanted to go back to that was because it was more Catholic. And so there's this Anglo-Catholic movement back to that. And so there's a lot more. If you were to go to this traditional Anglican 1928 Book of Common Prayer service, we did music for a wedding. Remember when Raphael got married? that was that kind of church. You'd be really hard pressed not to think it was Roman Catholic. Just because it really has that feel to it. Anyway, there's this, in the Elizabethan settlement, so-called, you've got the Anglican Church finally taking hold, and toward the end of her reign, this talks about the Via Media Anglicanism. That's just the middle way, brought about by the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, and just kind of making everything moderate, so to speak. It was still very heavily enforced, but this sort of middle way Protestantism became the order of the day. This is what was exported, by the way, to America. By the way, how many states are named for British queens and kings? Well, the two queens that we've talked about tonight both have states named. Maryland is one, and it was settled by Catholics. And Virginia, for the Virgin Queen, who was never married, Elizabeth. And so we still feel this to this day. This kind of, we want religion, we want Christianity, but we don't want it to go too far. Don't be like those fanatics over there. And so Elizabeth was very good at kind of getting this whole thing. I don't fault her all that much. I don't fault anybody all that much. This was kind of new territory, and just to kind of get a handle on everything and sort of unify the people, she and others who came alongside did a really good job of unifying the people under a common church. I mean, what other church in the world could claim Ozzy Osbourne as a member? Because he was baptized in the Church of England.
Did she ever marry?
No. She was the so-called Virgin Queen. And so when she dies in 1608, who do they have to go to? Well, where do they have to go? Scotland. And so James II of Scotland becomes, or is it James I of Scotland becomes James II of England? One or the other. I don't have that in my brain here. But so they go outside of England to get a king, and it's also during this time, remember, that the kingdoms are starting to look toward unification. And because right now, what do we have? We don't have just England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. We've got the United Kingdom. And this is where it began to be united. Up heretofore, England and Scotland were enemies, really. They turned away proud Edward's army to think again, as the song says. But they still sing at Scottish soccer matches. That's what they sing. They say, "How's it going?" I sing a song. "The flower of Scotland, when will we see your like again? Fought and died for that we at Hill and Glen, that stood against him. Proud Edwards that stood against them. England!" That's what they all shout. Proud Edward's army, and send him homeward to think again. Anyway, all that changed after Elizabeth passes from the scene. England is now firmly Protestant. Scotland, by that time, which we'll deal with it, have to spend some extra time on Scotland, but they, I won't do that. But we're moving on. We're moving toward a united kingdom, and that kingdom has got to be also under the United Kingdom. There has to be a united church. Remember, people didn't think in terms of religious freedom. They thought in terms of you have to be loyal to the king. And in order to be loyal to the king, you have to be loyal to the king's church. And if you're not loyal to the king's church, then burn as a heretic. Not too many shades of gray here. You're either for or against. And it's only, even though there was the beginnings of toleration, religious toleration toward the end of her reign, there would still be a civil war to settle all this. But next time we'll begin talking about that, about the Puritans.